Chocks away on aircraft 7. Signal the catapult!
The convoy must be here by 0400 hours.
But the weather, Captain.
Lower away! Steady on the mark, steady! Hold it right there!
The convoy should be here by 0400.
But the hydrophones reported activity further east, Commandant.
発散準備だ！急げない！要請！援助探しろ！
Look at the size of this fleet. It's impossible.
They are already here, tracing this route. We must alert High Command immediately.
January 1942. The Pacific dawn spreads pale light across an endless expanse of ocean. Waves ripple beneath a horizon lined not by islands, but by steel leviathans. Aircraft carriers, stretching mile after mile, each deck a hive of movement, engines thrumming like living beasts. Smoke coils upward, black and heavy, mingling with the cold salt air. Sailors dash across flight decks. Planes are fueled, armed, and readied for launch. The clang of metal, the hiss of hydraulics, the constant roar of engines, a symphony of war in motion. On board a distant German cruiser, officers gather in tense silence. Maps spread across tables, instruments blinking, voices hushed but quivering. Reports have come in. Entire fleets of carriers, moving like floating cities, each bristling with hundreds of aircraft, each capable of striking hundreds of miles away. The scale is incomprehensible. This is not the war they had trained for, not the war of battleships and coastal bombardments. A chilling thought passes through every mind in the room. The rules of naval warfare have changed forever, and Germany may already be behind. Above the decks, catapults hum. Planes roar into the sky. The ocean itself seems to hold its breath. By the late 1930s, the world's navies were on the brink of transformation. Battleships, once the undisputed rulers of the seas, were being eclipsed by a new form of naval power, the aircraft carrier. Japan and the United States, in particular, had embraced this shift with remarkable speed. Carriers were no longer mere support vessels. They had become floating air bases, capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles, striking targets far beyond the horizon. Each carrier carried dozens of aircraft, from dive bombers to torpedo planes, their decks alive with the frantic rhythm of preparation. In contrast, Germany's Kriegsmarine had concentrated on a different vision of naval supremacy. The Treaty of Versailles had limited its fleet, and even after rearmament in the mid-1930s, the German surface navy remained relatively small, heavily reliant on battleships, cruisers, and U-boats. Germany had no operational aircraft carriers, and naval aviation was minimal. German officers were trained for engagements of the old school, gun duels, torpedo attacks, and coordinated fleet maneuvers. The concept of hundreds of planes taking off simultaneously from a moving city at sea was alien. The early months of World War II in Europe reinforced this mindset. The Kriegsmarine's role was tactical and strategic but limited. In the Atlantic, U-boats prowled the waters, striking merchant convoys with devastating efficiency. Surface engagements, like the Battle of Narvik in 1940, showcased skill and bravery, but adhered to traditional naval doctrines. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, the Imperial Japanese Navy had quietly perfected carrier operations, training pilots rigorously, synchronizing deck crews, and mastering the orchestration of multiple carriers moving in cohesive task forces. By December 1941, the world's eyes turned to the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated the terrifying potential of carrier warfare. In mere hours, Japanese carriers had struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet with surgical precision. Battleships, considered symbols of might, were left burning, capsized, or sunk. From a German perspective, reports of these strikes trickled through naval intelligence channels. Admirals and officers pored over photographs and intercepted communications, their minds grappling with a new reality. Here were fleets not anchored to firepower alone, but propelled by air superiority. These floating cities could traverse the oceans, invisible until their aircraft emerged, capable of annihilating targets before a single shell was fired in response. Even before these events reached German officers firsthand, the technical disparity was evident. Radar systems were still in their infancy. Carrier decks were overcrowded and dangerous, yet they were operationally flexible. Pilots could be launched, recalled, or redirected in minutes. Battleships, no matter how heavily armed, could be bypassed entirely. The psychological effect on naval planners was immediate. The familiar calculations of engagement range, armor thickness, and gun caliber suddenly seemed inadequate. Germany's officers, trained in meticulous planning and cautious maneuvers, found themselves facing a form of warfare that demanded speed, coordination, and imagination far beyond their experience. Every report of a carrier task force moving in formation, launching planes in waves, and coordinating attacks with naval aviation sent a shiver through the corridors of the Kriegsmarine. Their maps, once the tools of confidence, now seemed incomplete. The ocean had become a stage for machines of unparalleled reach and agility, and Germany had no actors on it of comparable scale. By early 1942, it was clear that any confrontation with these fleets could not be fought on the old terms. The war at sea was no longer about steel alone. It had become a contest of air, coordination, and speed. German officers who had studied naval textbooks for decades now faced a new problem: how to engage an enemy whose strength could appear and vanish across hundreds of miles and hours. It was not just a tactical concern. It was a fundamental shift in naval warfare, one that demanded respect, fear, and urgent reconsideration of strategy. The stage was set. Across thousands of miles of Pacific water, entire carrier fleets moved with silent efficiency. Each ship a hub, each plane a missile, each flight deck a launch pad for an unprecedented force. German eyes, peering through intelligence reports and reconnaissance, could only watch and try to imagine a response. The seeds of terror were sown long before the first direct encounter. The realization was sinking in. The carriers were more than ships. They were cities, moving with the ocean, unstoppable and terrifying. By early 1942, the reality of carrier dominance became undeniable. The Pacific theater, stretching from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, had become a proving ground for Japan's meticulously trained carrier fleets. For German officers, the first true awareness came not through direct engagement, but via intelligence and intercepted communications. Reports of Japanese carrier movements, sometimes involving 4 or 5 carriers operating in unison, reached Berlin and the Kriegsmarine's command centers in fragments, each more staggering than the last. One such report described the Kido Butai, Japan's main carrier strike force, moving south toward the Dutch East Indies. Its composition was extraordinary. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, each a floating airbase capable of launching dozens of planes simultaneously. Observers likened the sight to a city moving over the waves, its deck crews orchestrating a ballet of machinery and men. German officers, accustomed to battleships and cruisers engaging in predictable gun duels, could scarcely comprehend an armada where the primary weapons never touched the water. The strategic implications were clear. Entire islands could be attacked, supply lines severed, and fleets destroyed without ever encountering an enemy surface ship. German naval planners, observing from afar, realized that any attempt to counter such forces with traditional cruisers or battleships would be hopeless. The Battle of Taranto in November 1940, where British carriers had crippled the Italian fleet, had already hinted at this transformation, but the scale in the Pacific was unprecedented. Interceptions of Japanese communications, combined with reconnaissance photographs, painted an even more unsettling picture. Carriers launched coordinated strikes, often in waves of 30 or more aircraft, sometimes over 200 miles from the target. Reconnaissance planes scouted ahead, radioing exact coordinates for precision attacks. Each carrier operated as both offense and defense, screening its companions with fighter aircraft while maintaining the ability to strike deep. For German officers studying these reports, the logistics alone were terrifying. Fuel calculations, flight deck operations, pilot rotations, all executed flawlessly across thousands of miles of open sea. Human reactions mirrored the tactical astonishment. Letters from Kriegsmarine officers stationed in East Asia, intercepted or declassified after the war, reveal shock and even disbelief. One officer noted, "It is as if the enemy carries cities on the waves. There is no place to hide. No battleship, no cruiser, no coastal defense can stand against this." Another memorandum warned that Germany had no effective counter, and that relying solely on submarines or surface raiders would be insufficient. The psychological impact was profound. Fear was not just of the carriers themselves, but of the entire doctrine they represented. This fear was compounded by logistical realities. German surface fleets, powerful but limited in number, lacked the reconnaissance capability and long-range air support to confront a dispersed, fast-moving carrier task force. Even the legendary Bismarck, with its heavy guns and armor, was vulnerable to aircraft launched from miles away, as its eventual sinking would later demonstrate in a different theater. For officers accustomed to deciding engagements based on firepower and armor, the new paradigm was disorienting. The ocean had become a vast chessboard, but the rules had changed, and the carriers moved like queens, unrestricted, dominant, and terrifying. By the spring of 1942, intelligence reports confirmed that German officers were not alone in their astonishment. Allied planners, facing the same Japanese formations, shared a sense of awe and dread. The sheer size of coordinated carrier fleets, their speed, and flexibility had rewritten the rules of naval engagement. For Germany, the lesson was harsh. The age of battleships ruling the seas had ended. Any naval confrontation without carrier support was a gamble with slim odds of success. The German Naval Command, already stretched thin across multiple theaters, began discussing alternative strategies. Submarine warfare, surface raiders, and indirect engagements would have to compensate for the absence of carriers. But even these measures felt like small gestures against the immense, moving citadels Japan deployed. The notion that war could now be fought and lost without a single traditional ship-to-ship gun battle weighed heavily on officers' minds. And so, the stage was set for the first direct encounters. German officers, once confident in their training and doctrines, now faced a reality that challenged every assumption about naval warfare. The terror they felt observing carriers from afar would only intensify when fleets clashed, when the mechanical cities at sea proved their deadly efficiency firsthand. The first time German officers and sailors truly grasped the scale of carrier operations, it was often through second-hand reports, photographs, or captured communications. The human reaction was a mix of awe, disbelief, and fear. For officers who had spent years training for conventional naval engagements, the concept of hundreds of aircraft launching from a single ship, coordinated across a task force, was unimaginable. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal the psychological weight of these realizations. One officer wrote of sleepless nights spent imagining waves of dive bombers descending on their ships, realizing that their thick armor offered no protection against an unseen enemy. Fear was not just of physical destruction. It was the terror of irrelevance. Traditional tactics, meticulously drilled for decades, seemed suddenly obsolete. Sailors, too, felt the weight of these changes. Many recounted hearing stories of Japanese pilots strafing islands, bombarding ports, and sinking vessels long before the Kriegsmarine could respond. Morale fluctuated as officers tried to prepare their crews for engagements that could arrive from hundreds of miles away, with little warning. The human element, stress, uncertainty, and psychological shock played a crucial role in shaping Germany's response to carrier warfare. Carriers revolutionized naval strategy. For centuries, naval engagements have been dominated by battleships exchanging broadsides, cruisers patrolling for enemy raiders, and submarines ambushing convoys. The carrier altered these dynamics completely. From a tactical standpoint, the German Naval Command suddenly faced an opponent capable of striking long before their ships could close range. Engagements were no longer defined by line-of-sight gunnery. They were defined by aerial dominance, reconnaissance intelligence, and the ability to coordinate dozens of planes simultaneously. German officers, trained in classical doctrines, found their tactical manuals inadequate. Traditional formations, battle lines, and armor distribution could not account for aircraft capable of bypassing entire fleets, dropping torpedoes and bombs with precision. The carrier's ability to project power across hundreds of miles meant that German cruisers and battleships could be neutralized without ever engaging in a gun duel. Each tactical calculation became a gamble. One misstep could expose the fleet to annihilation from the air. At the heart of the terror was technology. Aircraft carriers were, in essence, mobile air bases, equipped with catapults, elevators, radar, and coordinated flight decks. They were marvels of engineering. German officers, by contrast, had surfaced ships bristling with guns and armor, but little means to detect or defend against long-range aerial attacks. Radar technology was emerging but limited, and coordinated fleet air defense was still in its infancy. The Japanese and American navies, meanwhile, had perfected the orchestration of multiple carriers within task forces. Their planes could scout, attack, and return to the decks with remarkable efficiency. German intelligence noted the precision with which flight operations were executed, the speed at which pilots were refueled and rearmed, and the seamless communication across hundreds of miles. To the Kriegsmarine, it seemed as though these floating cities were alive, each acting in concert with uncanny precision. The technological gap was not just in hardware. It was in doctrine, training, and operational integration. The combination of human shock, tactical upheaval, and technological superiority created a profound sense of unease among German naval officers. The realization that entire fleets could move undetected, launch waves of planes, and strike with impunity forced Germany to rethink everything it knew about naval warfare. But the implications extended beyond the officers' personal fears. Leadership decisions, enemy perspectives, and moral considerations would soon magnify the impact of these floating cities. For German admirals and high-ranking officers, the emergence of carrier warfare presented a profound leadership challenge. Experienced commanders, schooled in decades of traditional naval doctrine, now faced an enemy whose capabilities defied conventional thinking. Decisions that once relied on gun range tables, armor thickness, and ship positioning were suddenly inadequate. Admiral Erich Raeder and other senior officers monitored reports from the Pacific with growing concern. Task forces moving like floating cities required strategies that Germany simply lacked. Leadership decisions were complicated further by the uncertainty of timing and scale. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese carriers could strike across vast distances, but the exact location and composition of these fleets were often unknown. Commanders had to make critical choices with incomplete data, knowing that any miscalculation could result in catastrophic loss. The weight of responsibility was immense. Officers described feeling a mix of frustration and fear. They were trained to lead men in a battle, yet the enemy's very presence rendered traditional tactics ineffective. Their leadership had to evolve quickly, balancing caution with initiative in an unfamiliar form of naval warfare. From a German point of view, the enemy was no longer defined solely by nationality or fleet size. It was defined by capability and innovation. Reports from Japan revealed task forces capable of simultaneous reconnaissance, strike, and defense operations, all coordinated across hundreds of miles. German officers recognized the efficiency, discipline, and audacity of these fleets. Intercepted communications revealed meticulous planning. Planes launched in waves, reconnaissance scouting ahead, and flight decks operating like clockwork. The psychological impact of these enemy capabilities was as significant as their physical threat. For Germany, the very idea of confronting a fleet that could move like a city at sea, strike with hundreds of aircraft, and retreat before a single shell could be fired was disorienting. Officers compared the enemy to a force that had rewritten the rules of engagement. The enemy was not merely ships and planes. It was an operational concept that Germany had yet to master. This realization instilled a cautious respect, tinged with terror, that shaped strategic thinking throughout the early years of the Pacific Theater. The moral dimension of facing carrier-based warfare was equally profound. German officers were acutely aware that their traditional strategies, surface combat, coastal bombardment, and commerce raiding, were increasingly inadequate. The psychological shock of confronting fleets that could strike anywhere, anytime, forced a reckoning with the limitations of experience and doctrine. Decisions were no longer just tactical, they were existential. Strategically, the emergence of carrier task forces reshaped the very nature of naval power. Control of the sea was no longer measured solely by battleships or cruiser tonnage, but by the ability to project air power across vast distances. The German Navy had to rethink deployment strategies, relying more heavily on submarines and raiders. But these measures could never replicate the flexibility and reach of a carrier fleet. The realization of this imbalance influenced operational planning, resource allocation, and even the psychology of officers at the front. The moral weight of confronting an enemy that seemed invincible at sea was heavy. Leaders were forced to accept that the rules of warfare had changed, and failure to adapt could mean not just defeat, but complete strategic irrelevance. The combination of leadership dilemmas, enemy innovation, and strategic moral weight created a tense, almost cinematic anticipation. German officers, haunted by reports of massive carrier fleets, understood that a direct confrontation would not be like any battle they had trained for. The human fear, the tactical uncertainty, and the technological disparity set the stage for a pivotal moment. A decisive encounter that would confirm the terrifying effectiveness of these floating cities. The tension built inexorably, and soon, the war at sea would reach its climactic turning point. Spring 1942. The Pacific was a chessboard of endless blue, but the pieces had changed. German officers, still reeling from intelligence reports, now faced the prospect of confronting the new reality of naval power firsthand. While Germany did not have carrier fleets in the Pacific, its naval attaches, advisors, and intelligence operatives closely observed the unfolding encounters between Japan and the Allies. The events provided a stark demonstration of what carriers could accomplish and why they had become both a psychological and tactical threat. One such engagement came during the early stages of Japanese operations in the Dutch East Indies. Intelligence reports detailed the Kido Butai carrier strike force moving south with precision. For carriers, bristling with aircraft, coordinated attacks on Allied airfields and naval installations. Observers noted how reconnaissance planes scouted targets miles ahead of the main fleet, feeding real-time data back to the carriers. In a single wave, dive bombers and torpedo planes swept across harbors, sinking transport ships, oil depots, and lightly defended cruisers. German officers studying these accounts described the operation as almost cinematic, yet terrifying in its precision. One memorandum from a Kriegsmarine intelligence officer stated, "The scale and coordination of these fleets surpasses any traditional engagement. It is as if the enemy moves entire cities across the sea, delivering devastation without warning." The language reflected not exaggeration, but the genuine disbelief of officers accustomed to battleships dueling at predictable ranges. The tactical brilliance of the carriers lay not just in firepower, but in unpredictability. Fleet formations constantly shifted, confusing reconnaissance efforts and making interception nearly impossible. The Japanese employed layered defenses, fighter aircraft screening the carriers while bombers struck targets simultaneously. Each carrier's flight deck functioned like a heart, pumping waves of aircraft into the sky, striking and returning in a seamless rhythm. German analysts noted that even a heavy cruiser, with its formidable guns, was almost helpless against an enemy capable of striking from 100 miles away. Reports of these operations reached German Naval Command through coded transmissions and intercepted communiques. Officers pored over photographs showing aircraft lined on decks, catapults primed, and crews moving with mechanical precision. The human element, the trained skill of pilots and deck crews, amplified the terror. German officers realized that destroying a carrier was no simple task. Even if one were sunk, the operational impact on the fleet was minimal. Another carrier could replace it, and air groups could disperse and continue operations from alternative decks or bases. By May 1942, similar patterns emerged in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns. German attaches recorded accounts of air raids that transformed naval warfare into something almost unimaginable. Ports obliterated without a single battleship firing a shot, entire convoys annihilated before they could form defensive formations. Officers in Berlin began to internalize the implications. Carrier warfare was not a temporary tactic. It was a permanent shift in naval strategy, one that Germany could not replicate without a complete overhaul of doctrine and technology. The fear was not abstract. It manifested in strategic planning sessions, where senior officers debated responses. Could surface raiders intercept a dispersed carrier fleet? Could submarines strike before planes launched? Every option seemed limited, risky, or futile. The human weight of responsibility pressed heavily. The commanders had to advise Hitler and the Kriegsmarine on potential strategies, knowing that any miscalculation against such mobile, unpredictable forces could be catastrophic. Historians note that this period marked a psychological turning point as much as a tactical one. German officers, reading after-action reports and intelligence briefs, were confronted with an operational reality they could not match. Carrier fleets, moving like cities across the ocean, could strike anywhere at any time. For the first time, the officers truly understood the scope of the threat. It was not merely destruction of ships, but the total reshaping of naval doctrine. In private journals, some officers expressed fear that traditional German naval strengths, battleships, cruisers, and submarines, would be rendered irrelevant. Others wrestled with the enormity of adaptation required. Carrier operations demanded air power integration, logistical flexibility, and a coordination network that Germany had not yet developed. The combination of speed, range, and unpredictability created an almost cinematic tension in the minds of those planning responses. The stage was set. Across thousands of miles of ocean, the first real clashes were imminent. German officers could no longer rely on doctrine alone. Every reconnaissance report, every intercepted communique, and every intelligence photograph underscored the same truth. The floating cities of the carriers were not only a new weapon, they were a new era of naval warfare. The dread and anticipation building within the Kriegsmarine foreshadowed the inevitable confrontation. When the first direct encounters occurred, the lessons of these reports would be writ large in fire, smoke, and human struggle, proving once and for all that the rules of the game had changed forever. Summer 1942. The Pacific Ocean had become a theater of constant motion, a vast arena where carriers moved like colossal, mobile fortresses. For German officers observing from afar, the reports were no longer theoretical. They were witnessing the deadly efficiency of these floating cities in full action. Though Germany did not face Japan's carriers directly, intelligence from Axis naval attaches and intercepted communications allowed officers to track the operational impact of these fleets on Allied forces. One of the most striking examples came from the series of raids on Allied positions in the Dutch East Indies and New Guinea. Japanese carrier groups, operating in coordinated task forces, launched repeated airstrikes against ports, airfields, and convoys. Hundreds of aircraft were deployed in waves, overwhelming defenses. Docked ships were sunk before they could even move. Supply depots were reduced to smoldering ruins, and scattered Allied forces were forced into disorganized retreats. Observers on the German side noted the precision and speed. Carriers were rarely in harm's way, yet their planes delivered maximum destruction. The impact on German strategic thinking was immediate. Naval officers studied photographs showing harbors obliterated by aerial bombardment, noting the efficiency of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter escorts working in unison. They compared these coordinated strikes to their own doctrines: surface engagements, gunnery duels, and limited-range air reconnaissance. The contrast was stark. The human element, trained pilots executing flawless missions, amplified the technological superiority. German intelligence reports repeatedly emphasized the psychological shock inflicted on enemy forces. The mere sight of a carrier formation could cause panic, disrupt command chains, and render traditional defenses ineffective. Direct consequences became visible in casualty and loss reports. Hundreds of Allied personnel were killed or wounded, dozens of ships destroyed, and entire air squadrons neutralized in single operations. The operational tempo was relentless. Carriers could strike, recover, refuel, and redeploy in a matter of hours. German officers understood that attempting to confront such forces without comparable capabilities was tantamount to suicide. Every intercepted report reinforced the same chilling realization. Surface firepower alone could not dictate the outcome of modern naval engagements. The psychological effect on German officers cannot be overstated. Journals and post-war memoirs describe a pervasive sense of helplessness. One Kriegsmarine analyst wrote, "We are witnessing a new age of warfare. Ships of steel are no longer the arbiters of victory. Airborne power, coordinated across the seas, has rendered our fleets vulnerable before the first shell is fired." Another officer noted, "The carriers are like cities moving in formation. We can observe, calculate, and plan, but there is no adequate counter yet known to us." The terror was both strategic and existential. Germany faced a form of naval power that could strike anywhere, anytime, and with precision that outpaced its ability to respond. Even when German surface raiders engaged in indirect operations, the lessons of carrier warfare were clear. Small flotillas or commerce raiders might achieve temporary tactical success, but against fleets with integrated air support, they were vulnerable to rapid reconnaissance and devastating aerial counterattacks. The combination of mobility, reach, and tactical flexibility ensured that carriers dominated not just the ocean, but the strategic imagination of every naval officer forced to plan around them. The culmination of these realizations became evident in strategic discussions in Berlin. Admiral Erich Raeder and his staff debated alternative methods to challenge the Japanese. Submarine wolf packs, surface raiders, and limited coastal strikes were considered, but each option highlighted the stark disadvantage Germany faced. Carrier fleets, moving like cities at sea, had redefined engagement distance, operational tempo, and psychological impact. Any direct confrontation without equivalent air power was a calculated risk, one likely to end in catastrophic failure. By late summer 1942, German officers had internalized a harsh truth. The first decisive encounters had already occurred, not in direct combat, but in the overwhelming demonstration of operational doctrine, scale, and flexibility. The carrier's ability to strike at multiple points, recover, and redeploy, coupled with the meticulous training of crews and pilots, had set a new benchmark. German naval doctrine, developed over decades, was suddenly inadequate. The human reaction, fear, awe, and forced adaptation, intertwined with the tactical and technological lessons, creating an inflection point in German naval strategy. The stage was now set for a broader understanding of carrier dominance. German officers, haunted by reports, photographs, and intercepted communications, knew that the ocean had changed. Battleships, cruisers, and traditional surface tactics were no longer sufficient. The floating cities of carriers had proven their supremacy, mobile, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient. The turning point was clear. The era of naval warfare had shifted irrevocably, and Germany had to reckon with a new type of power that moved with precision, reach, and unstoppable momentum. By late 1942, the implications of carrier supremacy were undeniable. German officers, long trained in battleship-centered doctrine, faced the harsh reality that surface fleets alone could no longer dictate the outcome of naval engagements. The reports streaming from the Pacific, the destruction of ports, convoys, and airfields, confirmed what intelligence had hinted at for months. Entire fleets could be neutralized without a single direct gun duel. The carrier's mobility, reach, and coordinated air power had rewritten the rules of engagement. Strategically, the Kriegsmarine faced a dilemma. With no operational aircraft carriers of its own, Germany had limited options. Submarines remained the primary offensive tool, capable of harassing shipping lanes and striking at isolated targets, but they lacked the reach and versatility of a carrier task force. Surface raiders, though still formidable, could not contend with fleets capable of launching coordinated aerial strikes hundreds of miles away. Even planned sorties against Allied naval forces required careful consideration. A misstep could result in the loss of expensive ships and irreplaceable crews. Reports from German attaches in East Asia highlighted the psychological and operational impact on officers and sailors alike. Diaries and memos describe the apprehension felt when considering potential confrontations with carrier fleets. One naval analyst wrote, "Our ships may move, but the enemy strikes faster, further, and with more precision than we can hope to counter. Every decision is shadowed by the presence of those floating cities." These words captured a broader strategic unease. Germany could no longer rely solely on traditional naval strength to assert dominance at sea. The losses inflicted by carrier operations, though primarily on Allied forces, forced German planners to rethink allocation of resources. Emphasis shifted to intelligence gathering, submarine deployment, and small-scale raiding missions. Every plan accounted for the potential presence of enemy carriers, their aircraft, and the devastating consequences of underestimating them. German strategy moved from confidence in hardware to caution dictated by air power dominance. Beyond tactics, the aftermath revealed a deeper transformation: the erosion of certainty. In pre-carrier doctrine, German officers could predict engagements, calculate odds, and prepare contingencies. Now, the unpredictability of carrier task forces injected uncertainty into every strategic calculation. The fear of encountering a fleet capable of launching waves of aircraft from hundreds of miles away affected deployment, convoy scheduling, and even port selection. Commanders recognized that the very geography of the Pacific, the vast distances, scattered islands, and open waters, favored carriers over traditional surface ships. The lessons were also operational. Intelligence emphasized the importance of reconnaissance, early warning systems, and adaptability. German planners began documenting the tactical sequences of carrier strikes, studying flight deck procedures, launch intervals, and coordination between air groups. Although Germany could not replicate these capabilities, understanding them became essential to mitigating losses and preparing for potential encounters. Knowledge, it seemed, was the only defense available against the overwhelming reach of carrier-based forces. In addition to strategic and operational consequences, the psychological impact lingered. German officers, many of whom had grown confident in the invulnerability of battleships and cruisers, now faced a constant, looming threat. Reports described tension in command meetings, careful deliberation over fleet movements, and even instances of hesitation or delay in issuing orders. Small but significant reflections of the pervasive fear. The carriers were not just a tactical challenge. They were a psychological weapon, shaping German planning even in theaters where direct engagement had yet to occur. By the end of this initial phase, German naval doctrine had shifted subtly but irreversibly. Battleships, though still powerful, were no longer the central instrument of control. Submarines and raiders became the primary offensive tools, reconnaissance and intelligence the new lifelines, and caution the guiding principle for every deployment. The era of surface supremacy was over. The age of carrier dominance had arrived, and Germany's officers, though trained and capable, had no choice but to adapt or risk irrelevance. The recognition of this new reality set the stage for further reflection. Beyond the immediate operational adjustments, officers began considering long-term implications. The future of naval strategy, the allocation of resources, and the psychological lessons of confronting an enemy whose mobility, coordination, and technological mastery were unprecedented. The carriers had not only won battles, they had forced Germany to reimagine the very nature of naval power. As 1943 approached, the full ramifications of carrier supremacy became evident to German naval planners. The initial shock had given way to a sober understanding. Surface fleets alone could no longer guarantee control of the seas. Every strategic discussion in the Kriegsmarine now accounted for the reach, speed, and flexibility of carrier task forces. German officers recognized that the Pacific engagements, though distant, offered critical lessons for the broader war. Operationally, Germany's response was constrained but deliberate. Submarines, the U-boats that had once prowled the Atlantic with terrifying efficiency, were repositioned to exploit weaknesses in Allied supply lines, hoping to strike where carriers could not project immediate power. Surface raiders were deployed cautiously, their movements meticulously calculated to avoid detection by air reconnaissance. The absence of a carrier fleet left Germany reliant on indirect methods, emphasizing stealth, surprise, and opportunistic engagement. Every operational plan incorporated contingency for potential carrier interference, reflecting the lessons learned from the early months of Pacific warfare. Psychologically, the impact lingered long after the reports had been analyzed. Officers described a persistent tension in strategy meetings, a wariness in decision-making, and a heightened sense of accountability. The floating cities were not merely tools of destruction. They were symbols of a new era of naval dominance, reshaping expectations and forcing a reevaluation of long-held doctrines. Even in theaters where direct engagement was unlikely, the knowledge that the enemy could strike with such precision instilled caution and, in some cases, hesitation. German naval officers had to internalize a mindset in which the traditional metrics of strength, tonnage, firepower, and armor were no longer sufficient indicators of control or victory. Strategically, the lessons extended beyond immediate operations. The dominance of carrier fleets demonstrated that naval warfare had shifted from the predictable exchange of broadsides to a multidimensional contest involving reconnaissance, aerial power, and logistical coordination. Germany, without carriers, faced a permanent disadvantage in any theater where air power could dictate the flow of battle. This understanding influenced resource allocation, training programs, and the prioritization of technologies that could at least partially mitigate the threat, such as enhanced radar, anti-aircraft weaponry, and long-range reconnaissance methods. The long-term implications also touched on doctrine and planning. German naval theorists began documenting the tactical lessons of carrier engagements, the importance of early detection, layered defense, dispersal of forces, and adaptability in fluid battle conditions. These principles, derived from observation rather than direct experience, became integrated into Kriegsmarine planning, shaping the approach to both the Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters. Officers understood that while they could not replicate the carrier's capabilities, they could at least prepare their fleets to respond intelligently to the presence of such forces. Human accounts further underscore the enduring impact. Post-war memoirs and declassified reports reveal officers reflecting on the psychological weight of confronting an enemy that moved like a city across the ocean. One admiral noted, "We feared not only the ships, but the operational concept itself." The coordination, speed, and audacity were lessons in humility. Another officer remarked that the carriers had redefined the concept of naval power, forcing Germany to confront the limits of its doctrine, technology, and even imagination. By the conclusion of this period, the floating cities of carriers had achieved more than tactical victories. They had instilled a lasting transformation in German naval thought. Surface engagements were no longer the central measure of power. Intelligence, air superiority, and operational flexibility had assumed primacy. The fear, respect, and strategic recalibration experienced by German officers became a defining feature of how the Kriegsmarine approached naval warfare for the remainder of the conflict. The aftermath of these encounters set a clear trajectory. Germany had to adapt or risk irrelevance. The lessons of carrier dominance would echo throughout operational planning, fleet design, and officer training, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate losses. The stage was now ready for reflection, a calm, philosophical closure on the transformative impact of these floating cities at sea and what they revealed about the future of naval warfare. The story of carriers moving like cities at sea is more than a tale of ships and planes. It is a story of transformation, of how technology, coordination, and human ingenuity can redefine the very rules of warfare. For German officers, the shock was profound. A fleet's power was no longer measured by tonnage or armor, but by the reach of its aircraft and the precision of its coordination. The carriers revealed a new reality, one where mobility, flexibility, and intelligence could dominate traditional might. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical. Officers accustomed to centuries of naval doctrine found themselves confronting an enemy that could strike unseen, move undetected, and inflict devastation with breathtaking efficiency. The fear, awe, and respect they felt reflected a broader truth. Naval power had evolved, and those who failed to adapt risked irrelevance. Germany's surface fleet, formidable in its own right, was now a fleet constrained by circumstance, forced to navigate a world where the enemy ruled not by steel alone, but by the sky above the ocean. Yet beyond fear, there was clarity. The carriers demonstrated the potential of human organization and technological mastery. Deck crews, pilots, and commanders moved as one, executing operations with a precision that transformed abstract doctrine into tangible force. They showed that warfare was not static. It could evolve, innovate, and overwhelm even the most seasoned adversaries. In the end, the lesson is enduring. The floating cities at sea were more than machines. They were symbols of a new era, a testament to the marriage of human skill and technological vision. They forced Germany and the world to reconsider what naval supremacy truly meant. And they reminded us that in war, as in life, dominance is never guaranteed, and the rules can change in an instant, leaving those unprepared to confront the future in awe and, sometimes, terror. The carriers had moved across the oceans, leaving destruction in their wake. But perhaps their greatest impact was not measured in ships sunk or ports burned. It was measured in the minds of those who watched, calculated, and understood that the world of naval warfare had been forever transformed.